Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you here for our third symposium in our economic policy series. Just a quick, brief background about the Institute of Financial Economics. This is a joint event with the Institute of Financial Economics and UN Escrow. The Institute was created in 1983 thanks to the efforts of Dr. Makdisi and the generosity of five big banks in Lebanon: Audi, BLF, Blum, Biblos, and the Crédit Libanais. So since then, we've been very active in research. We have recently launched, or at the beginning of the academic year, we have launched our symposium series on economic policy. The first was about the national fiscal deficit back in October. The second one was about the challenges facing our banking sector. And this one, the current one, is the third in the series. It has a wider geographic scope, as you can see. It's the fiscal policy in the Arab countries. The speakers will present and discuss the report. You have copies outside if you'd like to get one, which examines whether or not current fiscal policies in the Arab region are up to the task of the 2030 Agenda and its 7 Sustainable Development Goals. One very important announcement. I'm very happy to announce that the team working at the IFE at the Institute has created a financial stress index. So what you see on the projector behind me is the financial stress index, the first for Lebanon. We've called it the IFE FSI. This index takes into account all the vulnerability indicators in the Lebanese economy. So we have the banking sector, stock market, monetary policy, and so on, in such a way as to detect and hopefully predict different episodes of high stress and low stress. The IFE FSI can be used to help policymakers, once vulnerabilities are detected, to determine when and which tools to use to mitigate or even avoid financial disasters. This will be officially launched sometime in March, but I'm just wanted to announce it today. As you can see, this event is being videotaped. It will be uploaded to YouTube as well as to our Facebook page. Please log on to our Facebook page. So it's www.facebook.com/AUBIFE. I will leave the floor now to Dr. Makdisi, who will be moderating this session and will introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. I would like to join you in welcoming our expert colleagues. This is a very interesting and important discussion we're going to be having today on rethinking fiscal policy in the Arab countries that have been published by Escrow. And the starting point of this book, the way I see it, is that, of course, public debt in the Arab world has come to reach unsustainable levels. Tax revenue collections are not catching up, therefore we're having a problem. And this has been a long-lasting problem, nothing new about it. And the problem, as the report says, that the problem with the fiscal deficits in the Arab world has been intensified by the fact that we live in a very conflictual environment, which leads to loss in income and therefore leads to loss in tax revenue as a result. Hence, the report that I think there are copies outside, right? The report outlines measures that should be taken to render the Arab fiscal policies not only sustainable in purely accounting terms. Now, this is very important. It's not a question simply of controlling the growth of debt, balancing the budget, but more importantly, see how fiscal policies can contribute to advancing the aims of inclusive development in the region. Hence, that's why it's termed rethinking fiscal policies in the Arab world, whereby past models, and here I think they refer to the Washington Consensus in the US, whereby even the IMF in past years, that whereby it is important to have a fiscal balance. But now, it's not simply important to have a fiscal balance between revenues and expenditure, but what is the composition of your expenditure? What are you doing with your expenditure? In what sense are the fiscal models contributing to promoting economic transformation, reducing poverty and inequality, and what they call closing the gap in health, housing, and education? So It's a question of moving from past fiscal models to more advanced models that take into account the issues of sustainable development, of inclusive growth, and so on. Of course, we look forward to our speakers elaborating on these issues. They are, in turn of appearance, we have Mr. Mohammed al-Mukhtar Mohammed al-Hassin, who will give opening remarks and is currently the Director of the Economic Development and Integration Division at Escrow, which he joined in 2014. Mr. al-Hassin has more than 25 years of experience in governmental affairs. He was Minister of Petroleum and Mines in Mauritania. He has experience in international development institutions, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and in the international private sector, including multinationals. He'll be followed by Nirjan by Khalid Abu Ismail and Nirajan Saranji, who will elaborate on the findings of the report. Khalid is the Chief of Economic Development and Policy Poverty Section in Escrow. His area of specialty is poverty and macroeconomic policies. He is the lead author of many UN flag publications on the Arab region, including the UNDP Arab Developmental Challenges and Reports and the Escrow-led Arab Middle Class and Arab Multidimensional Poverty Reports. Niranjan is the first Economic Affairs Officer in the Economic Development and Integration Division. He is the lead author of the report we are now discussing, Rethinking Fiscal Policy for the Arab Region. He is also one of the authors of several Escrow flagship reports, such as the Arab Middle Class and Arab Development Outlook Vision 2030. We also have, very pleased to have our discussant, who is the chief economist at the Bank Med, Mazen Suwaid. Mazen is also in the faculty of AUB. He teaches economics on a part-time basis. He was formerly the economic advisor to Prime Minister Fuad Seniora and staff member of the Middle East and Capital Markets departments of the International Monetary Fund, working on a range of country and international financial issues. So we're a very distinguished panel, and we look forward to that. May I suggest to the panelists that both Khalid and Nirajan will take about 25 minutes in elaborating on the report, and I understand Mr. Hassin would need about 10 minutes in his opening remarks, and I've agreed with Mazen that will take another 10 minutes. If I add them up, they come to about over an hour, 5 minutes or so, which will leave us about half an hour of open discussion, which I hope it will the presentations will stimulate. So without any further ado, please, we're going to be asking to begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Samir, Professor Leila, distinguished scholars, colleagues from Escrow, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this symposium hosted by the Institute of Financial Economics. I express my gratitude to Professor Magdesi and Professor Daghal for giving this opportunity and organizing this meeting. At Escrow, we launched the report Rethinking Fiscal Policy in the Arab Region on December 22nd, 2017, which is a report prepared by the Economic Development and Integration Division of Escrow, but also with great collaboration and inputs from other divisions. The team that has prepared the report is here, Khalid Abu Ismail, Niranjan, and Salima Raji, who is here in the audience. But we had also great input from other divisions of Escrow, as I said. However, the event of today is very special for us because we would like to discuss the main findings of the report in greater detail and share with you some of the ideas that the report proposes as Professor Magdisi has indicated earlier, for shaping the future directions in economic policy, especially fiscal policy. The report argues that many countries in the region are lagging behind in connecting fiscal policy and development aims. For several decades, Arab governments have predominantly emphasized privatization, liberalization, and the retreating role of the state through expenditure cuts towards achieving efficiency and macroeconomic stability. But given the increasingly precarious situation of many countries, solving today's development challenges requires a reassessment of accepted notions. Of course, a correction is required. That's what the report is about. As you know, the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development has ushered a renewed emphasis on the role of the state in steering economic and social transformation that is fully inclusive and sustainable. All our governments in the region are committed to the 2030 Agenda and are working hard toward progressing on the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, the report urges a departure from conventional fiscal policy reports. It proposes several primary considerations in order to align economic policy with measures to reverse the root causes of socioeconomic crisis and deepening disparities. Recommendations in the report build on the understanding that fiscal policy is crucial to economic reforms and social investments required to attain the inclusive and sustainable development. Fiscal policy can contribute to the new direction by being more consciously targeted towards restructuring economies to generate sufficient decent work, making systematic investment in high-quality human development, and using equity and sustainability as guiding principles in choices to raise and spend public resources. Ladies and gentlemen, fiscal choices can determine the space of poverty reduction, the prospects for decent work, the quality of investment in health and education, and the prospects for peace, among many other outcomes. Governance reforms and political stability will be equally critical in guiding policy towards those ends. Transformation will not happen automatically or overnight. But if the region hopes to be both prosperous and peaceful, transformation is an imperative. Managing this process will largely depend on transparent and accountable governance to set and keep rules. These must be fair and technically sound. In the region, governments have started putting greater efforts in raising domestic resources, and public budgets are becoming more conscious about spending resources toward improving economic and social outcomes. Reforming tax systems in several countries in the region has become a priority. These reforms need to take into consideration equity in order to get the maximum benefit out of it while keeping development objectives on track. This report by UN Escrow presents certain primarily consideration regarding ways of thinking about economic policy choices that can support the countries in their common quest for the vision of the future to achieve sustainable development goals. We look forward in an engaging discussion with you today, and thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to see my other two colleagues present the substance of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hassin. I think the next speaker is, you're going to be the next speaker, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Martisi, Professor Laila Daghe. And it's a pleasure for me also because my director and my chief are present because of whose I got the opportunity to lead the report. So it's a pleasure for me. And personally, I'm happy because I think I'm presenting the report to university students after a long time, after I left my university 15 years ago, I think. So this is a report which, I'm 5 years here in Lebanon, working in the regions. I'm fairly Arabized in my thinking and way of work, but my excuse is I still have to learn Arabic properly. Well, while we started working on the report, the motivation was what's going on, what is wrong in the region, and looking at it from the angle that what is happening to the real sectors in the economy and why high unemployment. And that was the time also the SDGs discussion was going on. And that's where we grounded the report in a way that how can the role of the state define a better situation for the people connecting to the real world. I mean, and that's where we thought that the policies that has been going on since past 30 years, since the 90s particularly, may not be producing the right results as happened in the Latin American, African context. I'm from Asia, so that is also was my guided motive because Asian countries did differently than what was exactly recommended in the Washington Consensus Principles. This report, while connect to those kind of thinking, of course, it doesn't presume that the role of the state requires a fundamentally very paradigm shift in thinking, but at least a fundamentally different perspective that the state can take. And because after Washington Consensus, the post-Washington consensus also thinks that the role of market is important. So, but it doesn't say how much the role of state should be. I mean, should it be just enforcing contracts, or should it be just creating the regulatory environment, or should it also provide some proactive support to create conditions for better human development and better living for everyone. And in that context, SDGs is important, and we are in the UN, so we took it as our guided principles. So in that situation, in that context, we prepared the report, and while we looked at it, we found the region is quite diverse. We are at Escrow, we work for the Arab region, we work for the member states and the Arab region. The region is quite diverse, and because it is fiscal, we situated the classification of the countries according to the oil rents or the sources of revenue. So there are several countries who depend mainly on the oil resources, oil and gas resources. They are called oil-rich countries. They include also some middle-income countries like Iraq and Libya, but mainly high-income countries. There are oil-poor countries. Not technically they are oil-poor. I'm not go by the definition of oil-poor or oil-rich, but they rely less on the oil resources, more on taxes. That's Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, and other countries. Syria, including Syria and Palestine. The other countries are well known in the region: Comoros, Djibouti, Mauritania, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. And you could see that across all the three classification, the conflict-affected countries are there. Iraq and Libya in the oil-rich group, Syria in the oil poor group, and in the low income countries, Sudan, Yemen, what's happening, you all know about it. And that's why the report, it was a challenging task. How do we analyze the fiscal situation across these three group of countries? Then how do we deal with the conflict affected countries? And that's where my colleague Salim Arazi contributed a really excellent analysis. And I think if you look at the report, you will find a special chapter on that. Having said that, the report, I'm just giving a little bit of overview of the report. It doesn't rely on any particular index or any particular methodology. You will find the first chapter, it provides the questions and the approach, how we have approached the questions. It describes the methodologies. And particularly, it focuses on kind of 6 specific issues. First, and that's where the presentation is, and I will be given the time, we are equally divided between Khalid and myself. First issue is fiscal policy and structural transformation. What is the role of fiscal policy? Has it supported structural transformation or not? And how fiscal policy can be used for structural transformation. The second issue that we look at is the role of social spending, the role of social spending, fiscal policy on social spending and human development, how it contributes to health, education, and human development in general. The third issue is the issue that Professor Magdisi raised rightly, that the region is at a precarious situation when it comes to debt sustainability. So what are the fiscal rules and how does it contribute to challenging or contribute to take into account the debt sustainability concerns. The fourth issue is, I think this comes out with our lot of discussions while preparing the report. We had several consultations with different people around in the region as well as from outside the region, from academia, that past 20-30 years have really focused on consolidation, price stability, macroeconomic stability by mainly looking at cutting expenditure. There is not much effort put. There has been a lot of talk about it, that you need to raise revenues, but there is not much effort put into that. So that's a special discussion on that. What are the issue of taxes and taxation issues and how to raise revenues. Then, of course, the usual suspect or my governance and fiscal policy are very much interconnected. One manifests, I mean, when I'm saying that, it means the poor governance manifests itself in affecting or adversely affecting the quality of institutions. So governance is one aspect, and that's where governance and human development is also connected, and that's where Khalid will be taking you to a little bit more detail than the last on conflict. So with this, let me go one by one, and then I'll hand it over to Khalid. The first issue is how fiscal policy is connected with structural transformation. Let's look at what is happening in the region on structural transformation. So far, the region is not able to accelerate economic diversification or structural transformation. What do we mean by structural transformation? We mean increasing efficiency of factors of production. It means labor moving out of agriculture to services sector or industrial sector where productivity is high, so that aggregate productivity increases. But this is all we have learned previously from other studies, that the aggregate productivity is really low in the region and the slowest growth in the world, and I think it is negative also if you look at it during this phase of past 6-7 years. And there is high unemployment, and youth unemployment rate is particularly high. These things we know. But if we look at systematically what happened to the sectors, aggregate productivity is low, growth is very low and negative in some cases. But what had happened to the sectors? A typical situation is, as you can see from the left, bottom left corner to the top right corner, is the moving. If the labor moves from that way, then you gain productivity. I'm giving example of 2 countries, Egypt and Morocco, because data on sectoral employment output is really scanty. So aggregation for the region was not possible for this particular graph. Two countries, time periods 1990 to 2013 for Egypt, 2002 to 2012 for Morocco. It essentially explains that over time, labor has moved from agriculture to non-agriculture sectors, particularly to services, because manufacturing has also lost its employment share in both the countries. You can see more description in the report about it, but from the graph it shows that although agriculture and manufacturing they have lost and they have gone to services sector, that's fine. But the lower half of the diagram shows that the productivity growth is negative. And that's no way explains structural transformation. Structural transformation means employment changes, labor share changes from, they move from agriculture to non-agriculture sector, but productivity increases. But that's not happening. And that means there is a low productivity trap. People have choices but to get engaged in the informal sector. Why that is happening? That's what the report deals with, why that's happening. And in the oil rich countries, here we do not have time series information. Unfortunately, data is a real problem in explaining these things the way we can. But we have 2 points of data, and if you look at 2000 and 2013 for Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which are leading economies in the oil rich countries, you will see the economies are more or less dominated by oil rent. The first two graphs, first two bars are on the value added share, and the second two bars are on the employment share. What we expect over time is that if there is diversification, then value added of different sectors would have changed, but hardly there is any change in the value added shares of each sector. In the employment though, there are some changes. Mainly if you look at construction and other services together. I'll just explain 1 minute what is these 7 sectors. They are classified by ISIC 3, I mean industrial classification, and data were made consistent. The last is the other services, which does not include manufacturing, does not include trade, does not include communications, all the high value added sectors. So we presume that other services mainly includes low value added activities. It is hard to say that it is entirely low value added activities, because it also includes some like financial services, which is very small, but it is there. It was difficult to disaggregate. But based on the 7 sector classification, we fairly assume that the other services are low value added activities mainly. And it is also explained in the figure that they contribute a huge share of employment. Both in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they contribute more than around 64 to 65% of the employment, but their value-added share is very low. In any benchmark economy, for example, if USA, you say the services sector constitutes 2/3 of the output, but I mean 2/3 of the employment. But it also contributes the same way in the value-added. So there is 1-to-1 correspondence, but here it is not. What happened in the oil-rich countries? Lot of diversification. If you look at the aggregate picture that is in the report, a lot of diversification has happened to real estate sector mainly, and to sectors which do not create much value, but they are based on imported low-skilled labor. What could be the reasons? So that's where we look at what happened to public investment choices. This graph shows that public investment across countries have declined, except for the oil-rich UAE. It has declined over time. The same way, private investment has not crowded in as expected. And this is also fairly well known now that, I mean, scholars like Isaac Diwan, Ali Abdul Qadir have also worked on this issue, that historically how public investment has declined. In the next slide, it shows that although current expenditure did not decline that much, because it's difficult to reduce current expenditure as a policy tool, but when there is a budget pressure, it is easy to cut from the public investment side. But the thinking was that if we reduce public expenditure and we gain some efficiency in allocation of resources, private investment will crowd in so that we can gain in terms of increasing economic activity. But that did not happen in the Arab region fairly, and that's a well-known fact by now from several scholars. So this kind of pattern in the public spending, and from here you can see that in the oil-rich countries also, 2000 to 2010, there was some increase in share of capital expenditure, but after that, there is a reduction in the capital expenditure, although current expenditure remains more or less same. So this shows that the political economy aspect of allocating resources or choices in fiscal spending. So so this kind of situation really do not help in creating industries or creating sectors that could help generating greater value addition to the economy. So this could be one of the explanations, and that's where we set our solutions on fiscal policy, how fiscal policy can proactively help certain industries or certain sectors that can create not only a higher output, but also that can be employment intensive. The second issue is how fiscal policy choices affect human development. And in the region, you will find, I looked at the mean years of schooling, average mean years of schooling. The education levels in the Arab world, to your surprise, is much lower than the world average. The capital stock, the mean years of schooling I'm talking about here, which takes into account average of mean education of people of 25 and above. And that's obviously in quite contrast to the Europe, which is around 12. And here, for the Arab world, the average is around 6.5. Imagine 6.5 years of education, what innovations or what kind of innovations can be expected from there. So in any industrialized world, the average years of education is much higher. And that's also one of the significant constraints that you find, because of which innovations could not take place in the Arab region. And that is also explainable from the fiscal choices that the countries have adopted. This is a graph which I think took me really long time, and with help of another colleague and several discussions, we've constructed this particular graph. Really took perhaps 2 to 3 months of time in making the data consistent over time, making sure that they are comparable and all that. Still, there are several problems. However, this is a comparable, fairly comparable figure, I will say. You see the health, education, housing, social protection. These are the 4 components of the total social expenditure that IMF provides data on. And a comparable series show that in oil-rich countries, education expenditure is almost stagnant. It hovers around 4%, but almost stagnant over time, 1990 to 2014. In oil-poor countries, I'm talking about Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Lebanon, Tunisia, those countries, the education expenditure was also more or less constant, like 6% of GDP, 5% of GDP. But over time, since 2010, 8 or 9, it has declined. Health expenditure is precarious, like 2%. Housing expenditure is declining, about 0.6% now. This is all quite different when you look at other countries. As benchmark, if you look at OECD countries. Of course, OECD countries, social expenditure covers a lot more. That includes pensions, that includes other support services. But health education, if you look at it, in OECD, it is like health is like 6% of GDP. Education is like 5% of GDP. But we are much behind that. So of course, in MDGs, we did well in achieving primary education and secondary education, but advancing the education levels was not possible. And with this kind of fiscal policy choices, they did not support that. On the debt sustainability, of course, public budgets are under high pressure, particularly, after 2008 it started, but particularly after 2010, they are under severe pressure. As you can see, the oil-rich countries who are traditionally having surpluses are now in deficit. The fiscal deficit 2014, from 2014 onwards, they have a fiscal deficit. And for some countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and some other countries like Oman, they have noted fiscal deficit up to minus 20% in 2016. Current account deficit is also in negative for the oil-rich countries. For the oil-poor countries, the fiscal deficit, which is the blue bar, you can see that from 2008 onwards, it has gone down significantly. I must mention here that these countries were doing well during the 2000 to 2008. The picture was really kind of showing that there is fiscal consolidation happening, there is better growth and all that. But 2008 onwards, fiscal deficit started continuing declining trend until 2016. Same also for the current account deficit. So this is a significant constraint that governments faced. And we look at why does that happen, and that is the period where countries were around a debt level of 90%, 95%, 97%. Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, I will not mention because you all know it is around 150%. So we look at what was the fiscal policy response to public debt. This is a phenomena that was probed way back in 1998 by Bowen. I think this is a seminal article. Most of you might have gone through it. I just made modifications to it, taking into account non-linearity in the equation. The explanation is that your present debt is dependent upon your past surpluses, primary surpluses. If you have surplus, then your debt level will be lower. If not, then of course it is going to increase. Is it only one period lag debt? How the primary surplus, or in other way, if you have a high debt, then you will adjust your primary surplus. Primary surplus means expenditure minus your earnings revenue, taking into account interest payments aside. But if it is not, then of course the debt is going to be higher and higher. So taking that into account, you will find interestingly this kind of graph where when you look at the response of primary balance to lagged debt to GDP. I'm talking about ratio, primary balance to GDP ratio and lagged debt to GDP ratio. They continue to decline, contrary to what happens in global scenarios. Generally, if there is high debt, then the primary balance should be positive. The response should be positive, means increasing debt. Primary balance should increase while there is high debt. But here, it is not so, and it continues to decline on an average until 90% of the debt on average. And I have put the mean and the median and the model. The bar is the model estimates, and they are the model is fairly fitted, as you can see. And Lebanon here is actually a kind of outlier, which is the top right corner. Most of it are Lebanon, because it's 150% that kind of situation in Lebanon. If you take it out Lebanon, then it is not a cubical function, rather it will be parabolic function, where after this there is something happened around that 90% of the debt level that countries started improving their primary balance, and I think we will talk about it here. Is the primary balance required, that is the debt stabilizing. If we consider stabilize the debt of the past year at the same level, suppose we have 90% of the debt. I'm not talking about reducing the debt, because there is a debate on debt levels and growth and that kind of thing. But our perspective is, we are developing countries and we need fiscal deficit. this graph shows the horizontal axis is the primary balance to GDP actual, and the vertical axis is the debt stabilizing primary balance. And that's a tool which I think the countries can use to see whether fiscal rules are applied or not. Because if you are doing, this is just an estimated, nothing in stone. This can be changed depending on your assumptions on growth and assumptions on interest rate. This is a play between that, and you can refer to the paper for the detailed methodology. For Lebanon, for example, the debt stabilizing primary balance to GDP ratio should be around 5% of GDP, but actually it is 1.5 or 1.6% of GDP. For Egypt, at the other level, the primary balance to GDP is negative. It can be, the debt can be stabilized even the primary balance is negative. But had they have taken that into consideration, they will not arrive in a situation like this where the debt to GDP is continuously declining at the same time primary balance. And this has happened mainly because of discretionary public spending, as I have explained it in the report in greater detail. And of course, as we know, that revenues, we are not doing well. The oil-rich countries, they do not rely on taxes. Algeria is an outlier here, but if I take into account the non-hydrocarbon revenues, it comes around 13%. The UAE is a little bit better off because it do charge corporate income tax to companies that produce oil and gas. But again, they have a rule of the highest taxed country, as per the rule, but the rule is applied very discreetly to the companies that they would like to apply. Otherwise, it's not. So, but other countries like the oil poor countries, they rely on taxes. But the average tax to GDP ratio for the oil poor countries is much lower than for the middle income countries, which is 20%, but for them it is about 15%. Tunisia and Morocco are good examples in the region. And this is my last slide. Here, not just revenue is low, but the revenue dependence, the tax revenue dependence is on the indirect taxes. And more interestingly, over time, the indirect tax share of the total tax revenue is increasing. So that shows a regressive pattern in taxation system. And you see in Jordan, you see in Morocco, Tunisia is fairly stable. Tunisia is a little bit doing well, and also they have a little bit reformed their income tax. But indirect tax share in 2017 is about 57%. This is 2012 that I have shown here. And on the other side, in the same graph, the income tax share is not changing that much, and very little from the wealth tax. Globally, wealth tax is like 7% of GDP, 7% of the total tax revenue. But for the Arab region, it's that either are present, not present, or very low. In the direct tax, I think this is my final point, I will say that in the direct tax, the incidence or the burden lies more on the middle class than on the rich. If you look at it for Jordan, data for all countries were not available. For Jordan, we did an analysis, and it shows that it's fairly progressive until you reach the 9th decile. But for the top rich, they do not pay that much tax. So there is a problem there are several problems of tax fairness, and also improving equity and raising tax potential. So here I will give it to Khaled. Yes, sure. Khaled.
Thank you very much, He promised he will conclude on a happy note, which he did, in fact. Khaled, you make up now for the lost hope.
You want me to conclude on an unhappy note. So. Okay, if I may just take the laptop. All right, thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Samir and Dr. Leila, for this kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here at AUP. And I wasn't supposed to present this slide, by the way. That's, but I can tell you what the story here is basically. I think this is a good entry point. That the fiscal adjustment story that happens typically when any country is in a crisis, economic crisis or fiscal crisis, relies on cutting expenditure. Now, if you're in Egypt as a decision maker and you're in 2014 and you're looking at your numbers, you're looking at your growth numbers, you're looking at your exchange rates, black market rates, you're looking at your reserves, you get to that situation and really the options are not that much. I mean, short-term stabilization will bring in the IMF and guess what? They're going to do their number crunching and yes, you have very little choices. You're going to have to cut expenditures in order to get the loan. That's a short-term adjustment that I don't think many of us, any economists will say this is right, this is wrong, because in a situation like that, you're in an emergency room. You need to heal very quickly. Our contribution in this report really is to avoid putting the economy in a situation that allows you to be in a very precarious situation. And I think this is an entry point, I think, for us to begin a discussion about the rethinking. But again, there are some issues here that I think it's good to begin with. One of which is, I think, pre-analytical. Before we even talk about the numbers, we need to be honest with ourselves. Fiscal policy is primarily a very controversial issue. Okay, so there's a lot of politics involved here. There's a lot of ideology involved here. There's a lot of preconceived notions involved here. I remember, for example, that when one of our great economists of our time, Lance Taylor, was teaching us about the stabilization experiences and the experiences of the IMF in a book he wrote on stabilization experiences for the 80s. He said that, guess what? We as structuralist economists, and we always believed that inflation was primarily as a result of people having conflicts, social conflict. We discovered that in many cases we were wrong from country experiences. The monetarists were sometimes right. In many cases, inflation did occur because of monetary policy problems or oversupply of money supply. So I think it's important to come to the discussion with this kind of modesty, which is, of course, as you know, a very difficult trait for most economists to have. So on this beginning note, I think that there's an important distinction to be made between the policies of the short term and the policies of the long term. In the UN, we are naturally more concerned with long-term policies. We're naturally more concerned with the development goals, the 2030 perspective. The medium and long term is our center of gravity. Okay? So what we try to do is to put aside these issues that we know are controversial, okay? And to say that no matter what, any kind of fiscal adjustment in a political economy context, you're going to have winners and you're going to have losers. And there's no doubt that if you talk about fiscal policy, you're going to talk about political economy issues. The other issue is, of course, that we're dealing with a very diverse region. And so one size fits all is impossible. There's no question that, whatever applies to a country like Egypt will not apply to a country like Saudi Arabia. So these are important considerations that, we need to have a little bit of considering these caveats that are very important, especially when we're talking on the policy. However, there are issues that I think there is minimum controversy towards, and I think these are the ones that we would like to highlight. One of these issues is that there's no doubt that the quantities of investment that exist in the Arab countries today, whether they're oil-rich or poor, will not allow you to make the kind of structural transformation that Niranjan has alluded to. So this is the first point. You want to do structural transformation, you're going to have to boost your investment, both private and public. Korea did it, and the Singapores and the Malaysias of this world, they did it with around 40% to GDP ratios. You're talking about our rates are like 10 to 15. You can't do it. There needs to be a quantitative boost. But you continue with the kind of ICORs, the incremental capital output ratios, and the efficiency rates that we have right now, you can boost as much as you want. If you're still going to be investing in real estate and quick wins and low value added services with the kind of informal structure economies that we have, it's not going to solve your problem. So alongside this quantity shift, you also need to have a qualitative shift. You need to have some kind of way to boost the efficiency of our economies. And that means not just fiscal or macroeconomic policies, that means the links with monetary policy. That means the links with trade and industrial policies. Industrial policy, which is seldom talked about these days. We don't talk about this in this report because then we'll be talking here for hours. But it's important to make that point. It's important to make that you need to raise the efficiency of economies. And the only way you can do that is to link this whole discussion to what's happening in the real sector. Okay? So this is the first thing that I think everybody would agree to. The second thing we'd agree to is that there's no question that social policy matters, and that at the heart of social policy are the issues related to poverty, especially in countries that have increasingly rising poverty rates because of the regional spillovers of conflict and the recessions that we're seeing. And in this case, if you look at the numbers for most countries, you'll see that the Arab region in particular are very sensitive to rising prices and inflation. No wonder inflation is more of a political decision than it is an economic decision in many countries. Because they know that a huge segment of Arab populations live just below and above the poverty line. You shift that poverty line even for 10% and you're going to have a huge response in terms of poverty. An example here from Jordan tells it. I mean, if you were to recalculate poverty rates after taking away all of the transfers, the public transfers, then you would almost have more or less double the poverty rates. And inequality, of course, it would also increase, but to a lesser extent. So that's the second most important thing when we talk about fiscal policy. You're going to have fiscal policy adjustments that are going to have impacts on prices. You're going to raise poverty significantly, much more than in any other region in the world. And there's a huge amount of publications that we did in the past 10 years to corroborate that statement. The third statement, and I think Niranjan made this point, is that you need to do a lot more about education if you want to do a structural transformation, both quality and quantity. But let's talk about the quantity here. I'm not going to talk about the TIMs and the problems we're facing, and that's another discussion. But at least you can do a lot more with just 1%. Right now you're far below the world average, but if you just increase even ceteris paribus, keeping everything else constant, you increase 1% annually on expenditure education, you can catch up with the world average by 2020. You can probably reach the Euro average by 2030 or close to 2030, okay? And I don't think many people would argue that that's important if you want to reach human development and structural transformation targets. The third thing is that there's no question, the fourth issue is that there's no question that if you want to do fiscal policy in this region and you want to think beyond the immediate term, the short term, there's a huge amount of space for you to collect money. And it comes from so many different sources. If you were just to plot a scattered diagram and look at the average country and the average tax to GDP ratio compared to other countries in similar GDP levels, you'll see that there's at least 5 to 6% points that you can have quick gains just like that over the next 3 years. By doing things like improving tax fairness and identifying, just get people to fill out compulsory tax returns. I mean, that by itself will get you a huge infrastructure, data infrastructure that will allow you to set your fiscal policies in a better manner. Of course, I had a discussion, I remember, with one of the decision makers about this issue, and I understand why decision makers are kind of reserved about this issue, because they worry about the possible ramifications on investors running out and all. That's possible, but I don't think that you can really have a shift, the kind of quantum leap shift that we're talking about, without much more transparency and the governance architecture of fiscal policy. And I think that's very important. And it applies not just to oil poor countries, but also to oil rich, because there the taxation rates, as Naranjan mentioned, are even lower. Because, of course, there's far less of a need to tax in and impose taxes in oil-rich countries that have much more fiscal space. So there's no question that there needs to be economic governance. There is an economic governance overhaul that needs to be done in oil-poor, oil-rich countries. But is it just that? And that's, I think, one of the questions that we pose in this report. Is it just economic governance, or is it more broader kinds of governance that need to be taken into account? And here I'm going to be talking more from a background paper that was done to the report, and just maybe take another maybe 5 minutes to explain the argument. And the argument is very simple. The argument is that if you look at the HDI and the basic quantitative human development indicators for Arab countries, in fact, from the 1970s over the long term, the Arab countries did amazingly well. And if you remember the 2010 Global Human Development Report that was published by UNDP, 5 of the 10 best cases in terms of progress in human development were from Arab countries. Oman was number 1, Tunisia I think was number 2 or 3. And the list also included Algeria, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia. But I remember a few months after the publication of that report, and Tunis happened, and people were wondering, why did this happen? And I think that's the issue that you need to address at heart in order for you to talk about the roots of the problems and the conflicts that we are facing in this region. So what we did is a simple exercise. We said, okay, let's bring in to the HDI another dimension. Let's add the voice and accountability and rule of law World Bank indicators as another dimension and give it the same way. So we basically, as we all know, the Human Development Index has economic pillar, it has a health pillar, an education pillar. We added a governance pillar. We calculated the index exactly the same way for 160 countries over time. And this is what we found, the scatter plot. If you plot the HDI, the old HDI, against just this governance index, you'll see that the relationship is pretty, I would say, linearly positive. Not a very strong correlation, but fairly decent. But what happens here is that, interestingly, if you separate between the 0.6 mark on the index, the governance index, and you look below that mark, you'll see the relationship is very fuzzy. There are a lot of countries with very poor governance that manage to score well on human development indicators, but the vice versa is true. Once you've crossed over this benchmark of 0.6, though, the relationship becomes very clear, linear and much stronger. And that's the argument, that there seems to be this cutoff threshold, this critical threshold of governance, that if you pass that mark, you really have this feedbacks between governance and human development are much stronger. Now come to apply that index to the countries worldwide, and you see that there is very little change at the top. The Norways, the Denmarks, US maybe affected a little bit. The Germanys, they don't really change in terms of rankings or score because they have that. They're part of that. They've already crossed that threshold. But when you look at Arab countries, you look at, here basically, if you're green, you're the best. If you're pink, you're kind of good. If you're orange, you're medium, and if you're red, you're really bad. Okay, and you can look at the governance dimension here. I don't need to say much. The average for Arab countries is 0.35. And even the highest Arab country, and this is 2013 data, and even the highest country score here is by Qatar 0.48 in 2013. That says a lot. We really have a governance problem. I mean, you look at the location of Arab countries on the scatter plots that I was just talking about, and we're all below the regression line. Of course, some countries are way below, and other countries are like Tunisia and Jordan, Morocco are closer to the regression line. But still, that's the argument that we're making here, that if you want to really talk about fiscal policy, efficiency gains, all of that stuff that was structural transformation, you need to talk about, you know, a political stability and governance that allows for these efficiency gains. And in order for you to do that, we need to talk not just economic governance, but other broader kinds of governance. Now, the other thing that I think was interesting to show here is that you look at the top losers worldwide from the application of this governance-adjusted human development index, and the list here is very clear. Look at the amount of oil-rich countries we have here. I mean, there are 4 Arab countries among the top 15, but look at the oil riches here. I mean, I think that by itself is a very important message, is that if you're going to do this governance transformation, it seems to be much harder to do if you are an oil-rich country. And of course, there's a whole literature on that I think we're all familiar with, and I think Professor Samir in particular has a lot to say. I have 2 more slides. One of which I think is important is in this table. If you wanted, and I think this is the gist of what we're saying, if you wanted to predict conflict in the Arab region in 2013, just look at the governance scores in 2000, okay? And look at the countries that had the poorest governance scores in 2000, and you'll see that a lot of them were in conflict 10 years after. Okay, so that, I'm not implying that there's a direct causality here, but there certainly is a correlation. And of course, the red numbers here talks about the percentage change, and it's self-evident that most Arab countries have actually declined on the good governance scale from 2000 to 2013. Now, again, a cautionary remark. I know these World Bank figures, there are problems with it. I know there's a lot of subjectivity. I know all of the criticisms. I'm not terribly happy myself with using this. We know these caveats, but they're not just for the Arab region, they're worldwide. So we're assuming that, you know, the ranks are representative of some kind of reality that we face in the region. All of this, as I said, has major implications on the issues of conflict. And as Salim would tell you, that everything we talked about, structural transformation, all of that stuff, it doesn't apply to countries in conflict. We have a completely different war economy dynamics happening there. We have a completely different discussion on how to avoid the Dutch disease, how to do reconstruction. It's another ballgame. The report talks about that in some depth. But just look at the order of magnitude of the problem. Look at these graphs here that just show you the difference between what was predicted to be the revenue to GDP path and the actual path for these countries. And you'll see the huge challenge that these countries face. Now, on a more positive note, to go back to Professor Samir's recommendation, I think there are opportunities. I mean, yes, we are in a pretty bad situation with conflict, but there really is an opportunity. And I think the reconstruction of war-torn economies, if it's done right, if you manage to do it, your macroeconomic policies in the context of a new deal that does rebuild the country's own capacity to rebuild itself and not turn away projects that are subcontracted based on, you know, some kind of major political deals that don't really have these kind of spillovers, then you'll be able to get the maximum benefit of the reconstruction. And then you'll be able to afford to do a lot more with the kind of limited fiscal space that we are having. So on this note, I would like to stop here and, you know, open for questions or for comments from colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khalid. Very, very much. Mazen?
Thank you, Dr. Mahdisi, Dr. Dagher, for this opportunity to comment on this very useful and informative paper, actually. I'll keep it simple since we have only 10 minutes. Where I agree, where I disagree. All right? Where do I agree? Obviously, the paper, as we say, put its finger on the wound in the Arab world, in which most Arab countries are stuck in a vicious circle, very low fiscal space, which leaves very low and inefficient spending on citizen empowerment. And what I mean by citizen empowerment, spending on education, health, infrastructure, and social protection. This leads to a low growth environment, which leads to more reliance on the government as both the employer and the provider of last resort, and therefore more and even narrower fiscal space. Obviously there is this vicious circle in which we are stuck, and I think addressing fiscal policy is key to getting out of that problem that is very common across Arab countries regardless of their development stage. That's point number one, in which I agree with. The second point I agree is that obviously there is not just a spending level issue, there is a spending efficiency issue. And we see that in most countries when we have, for example, higher spending on capex, higher spending on investment, it goes to basically increasing employment in the informal sector, in very low, basically value-added job creation. We see this in Gulf countries, we see this in Lebanon, for sure. And it relates to another point that I think they make, that I agree with, that changing economic structures have not led to higher end manufacturing, which is key, I think, to unlocking the potential in the Arab world. I mean, this region, if it's not capable to export high value-added product, it will not be able to close its gaps, whether external or fiscal in the long run. So obviously we don't just have a spending issue, because as we see in the report, Arab countries spend half what OECD countries spend on social causes. But obviously there is an inefficiency issue when we see that most of the spending, or a big part of that spending, goes on subsidies that actually do not target the most needed, but target those who basically, for example, consume most electricity, which are the rich, or most oil, which are people, of course, that are driving bigger cars. The third point that I agree with is the use of the term, there is need to be a crowding in of the private sector. I think this is really very important, because in the end we cannot talk about long-term development goals without that long-term development goal being led by the private sector. The government, especially our governments, will not be able to do it. It's the private sector that needs to be crowded in rather than crowded out, as it is happening now, and through definitely investment on innovation, human capital, and infrastructure, as pointed in the report. So these are the 3 points that I agree with. The 3 points I disagree with, and maybe they would have to do mostly with, I don't know, maybe wording, or maybe, my focus a little bit more on Lebanon, given that I'm a Lebanese economist rather than on other Arab countries. There is in the conclusion somewhere, the report says, I'm going to read, the Arab region has followed past models of pro-market economic policy making adopted from the Washington Consensus. At the same time, it has attempted to maintain a social contract premised on providing essential services to its people. This often contradictory combination has now reached a breaking point. I disagree that Arab economies have actually adopted a pro-market economic policy making. I don't think we have really applied the Washington Consensus in order for us to say that the Washington Consensus failed. I think what we have witnessed over the last 20 years in Arab world is not market capitalism, it's crony capitalism, privatization, and here we are getting closer to the political economy that maybe the report did not want to get into it. But when you are privatizing key sectors to your cousin, or to your brother-in-law, or to your son-in-law, this is not Washington Consensus, When you are selling state assets without heavily regulating them in order to assure both efficiency and equitable pricing, this is not market mechanism, The Asian tigers applied the Washington Consensus, and of course they got into crisis because of applying the Washington Consensus without basically taking into account other equity issues. But then when they applied them, they had a system that worked fine. We did not, I think, apply the Washington Consensus for us to say that basically now we need to go beyond that. Which leads me to the second point that I disagree with. Also here there is a line that economic models, of course in the Arab world, need to be reoriented to deliver not just greater efficiencies, but human development that leaves no one behind. Well, I disagree that economic models in the Arab world are already basically oriented to providing greater efficiencies. They are not, you know. Sometimes in the report we have the feeling that the efficiency issues are taken care of in the Arab world, and now it is really the distributional issues that we need to focus on. As I said, maybe probably it is a wording problem in some of the parts of the report where it tends to define the problem more as a distribution rather than as an efficiency. I think maybe because I'm from the private sector and I'm also involved also in economic policy making, but we are really significantly behind in the Arab world on efficiency, even before we get to distributional issues. Providing social protection, for example, this is another line from the report. Providing social protection and mobilizing revenues, taking into account equity and justice in taxation system. I mean, who is going to pay? Of course, you know, we know that that needs to happen, but who is going to pay? And this is, I think, the third point and the most important point that I disagree with, is that the report lacks the roadmap that we need. Of course, there are statements that we cannot disagree with. When we say only vibrant and productive economies can underpin a new social contract that provides everyone with the full range of capabilities and opportunities needed to thrive. Who can disagree with this statement? I mean, of course, we know that we are at point A, we need to get to point B. But how do we get to point B? That's the problem, you know. And because I am involved in policy making, as Dr. Maqdisi said, I was for a long time the economic advisor to the Prime Minister, and I'm still involved somehow in economic policy making. From when we are doing reforms or economic policies, the most difficult issue is sequencing. You know, what do you put first? You know, I mean, what comes first? And who is going to pay for it? And how do you basically reach that point without crashing other objective, like keeping your currencies fixed, if that is an objective, or basically suffocating the private sector through imposing high taxes. So, and I think really, you know, I mean, and I think my colleague here, Khalid, said, you know, I mean, at the UN, we like to think long term, you know, 2030 vision. I mean, how about the 2020 vision for the Arab world that basically makes sure that we do not crash in the next 2 years? And maybe here, this is again, as a Lebanese economist, I'm saying, you know, how about a 2020 vision that let me make sure that I don't default on my debt while keeping my currency fixed and my private sector, whatever is remaining of my private sector, alive and capable of basically pushing ahead. So in the end, you know, when I read the report, I had the feeling that this is a report that is, and it's very funny because you use the two countries that I wrote here, Korea and Singapore. I thought it was a report written for a kind of political systems that we tend to call enlightened dictatorships, you know, where basically you have a very strong central command that is designing an economic policies for the long run. And this is very good, you know, or Dubai currently, when you tell, for example, the UAE that you need to spend on this and this and that, this makes lots of sense. But the rest of the Arab world, countries that are now drawn with civil problems, sectarian divides, religious war, you know, and you are basically talking about the role of fiscal policy, you know, where now we're witnessing in Lebanon fights over the divide of the ever-shrinking cake, you know, through basically expenditure allocations, you know. I doubt, you know, how useful can that be in basically helping us to get out of this very, very dark tunnel that you rightly point to. Thank you.
Yeah. Imagine, this is very exciting. You know, I have many comments to make. Are you willing to stay beyond 6:45? We started 15 minutes late. If you are, so that I can open, I'm sure there are going to be lots of you know, cross commentary on this and comments from the floor. So if so, I will proceed, hoping that you will stay, and especially the economics majors here. I think we are expecting also some comments on what has been said. Very briefly, let me say, I mean, Mukhtar began by saying that, of course, the objective of the report is inclusive growth, is better quality of life, is education and health, reducing the deficit in education, health, and so on. Niranjan gave some sort of depressing indicators that things are not moving well in the Arab world. And I think it was the point was raised. Why is it that with the decline of public investment, it wasn't picked up, compensated for by private investment? Khalid did give more of a positive, look on things, and he said that if we reach a certain threshold in terms of governance, then we can really influence GDP, HDI rather positively. Mazen, of course, has raised a number of points, but you're not advocating enlightened political dictatorship, are you? I mean, I was afraid.
I don't think they're even possible.
But you are saying that, you focus on the fact that perhaps they are saying focusing more on crony capitalism than real, what you think is the proper Washington consensus of textbook market economics. Well, I mean, that one could argue. So let me not take more of that, but one more remark, Khalid, is that the word politics was mentioned only 60 minutes after we began. And I was waiting. I mean, we're talking about economic reform. Certainly, you're going to be talking about economic reform. I don't think the two really are disentangled. They go together. And the question I would ask Ranjan as well: do you think all these things can be done without having proper political democratic governance in the region? Would that be possible? I mean, that is really a basic question. But
that's a tough question. Let me answer that question.
No, well, but shall we open and then I will collect them, and then you can respond to what Mazen said as well.
Thank you so much for this very enlightening, albeit sometimes depressing presentation. Can you speak a little bit to the role of the international community, specifically to the effectiveness of development aid? This was an aspect that you were not mentioning, but I think this might be a very crucial aspect in terms of determining where the area is going to be headed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation about the publication. So my question is so my question is about Lebanon specifically. Knowing that we have three paths toward solving or actually building a new structural change, which is decreasing our expenditure, which is impossible because we're paying most of them for the electricity, wages, or paying our debt. The second, which is increasing our revenue, which is also impossible because 18% of the GDP are going for are got by taxation, which is impossible to increase because we're not grateful for it, knowing that we're not getting any decent services in return. And the third, which is increasing growth, which is also which is actually shut down by our tight fiscal space. So my question is, what is the window, or where exactly is the opportunity for growth before we even talk about development, knowing that it's the first step towards development, in Lebanon specifically? Yes, exactly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Ahmed Sheikh Abedi, consultant at Escrow, working in the Syrian crisis. But actually, the point that I'll be raising here, something it's always missed, I encountered in my career actually, related to the institutional setup actually in conveying fiscal policy to reality, which is the public finance management, and this is greatly related to the governance issue, because this is the area or the level where you can practice the governance exactly in budgeting, in revenue management, and also in public expenditure management. Because actually good intentions in fiscal policy doesn't find its way straight away to the reality without a proper or sound public finance management system. So this is what I wanted to draw attention to this point. Thanks.
You want to take first? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for provoking comments, Dr. Mazen. I think some of the questions I also disagree with you. I mean, and I agree with you most, but I also disagree with you a little bit. Where I agree with you is the first point that you raised, that you disagree. I agree with it because essentially you told the answer. The reason has not really applied. Washington Consensus is not one policy, but they are in the direction of macroeconomic stabilization, mainly price stabilization, privatization, and reductionary approach of the state, basically reducing public expenditure, releasing public expenditure from those areas and using it in a way that it can create private sector to come in. But the competition didn't happen as usual because of the crony capitalism. And I think people like Diwan and Kemet, they have the famous book on political economy explains that. So there I completely agree with you. The issue of economic models are not efficient. You raised. I think efficiency is an issue which I'm surprised that you were confused there because maybe it is not explained properly. The way the report is dealing with efficiency is you are by applying a policy where state can increase its efficiency by reducing public expenditure. That means per unit investment, the output will be higher. That's the gaining efficiency. And that happens in a world where when you reduce expenditure, but private sector come in, crowding in. But that doesn't happen. If that doesn't happen, investment, of course, it's a neoclassical theory that if total investment has gone down, then obviously you are losing efficiency. You are not gaining efficiency. And if you do not invest in other areas, for example, Korea would not have gained efficiency unless it has invested in other areas. Otherwise, even today, they will be producing rice. So the efficiency point is not just by cutting expenditure you gain efficiency per unit of expenditure, but how you distribute your resources so that you gain efficiency by promoting equity and redistribution. And that is where is the key message of the report, that for example, another country, I can give you an example. You create land distribution. I'm talking about southern India, south of India. One of the clear examples which is always given in the human development literature as one of the models of high human development. You create efficiency by an equitable, by distributing resources equally. So you create equity, and that raises efficiency. So that is one point. That is the point I was trying to say, that the report tries to promote not just efficiency in economic sense, 1 unit of reduction in public expenditure leading to. The other point you said, yes, it is a very critical question that who will pay. I mean, if you talk about Lebanon, Lebanon cannot keep on assuming that we are going to get resources from somewhere. Okay, that time is really it's difficult. I am hinting to what you know. I mean, possibly there is some resources and I will get it. But if that doesn't happen, someday there will be a judgment day. But today, the way it is, if you look at research by Piketty and his students, you will find that Lebanon has a very high unequal tax burden. Very high unequal tax burden, extremely high unequal tax burden. And that is extremely high even on the top rich bracket of the people. I think we have a graph on that. So there is potential to raise resources. The easy way of raising VAT and getting the tax revenue is always regressive. But they are doing that, and you can see the backlash from the civil society. So those certain points, I just wanted to respond to that. Yes, there are issues of sequencing and trade-off, and things are more complicated. I think that is for further discussion. I think that responds also to the question that the lady raised on Lebanon about increasing fiscal space. So there is a potential to raise fiscal space, I believe, by providing a level playing field by raising equity and by distributing the tax burden in a way that it can not just promote equity, it also raise resources. Then I think I will say that institutional setup and public expenditure management, probably I didn't highlight that. It is there in the report, and coming from India, I mean, when India got independence, we didn't have resources. But the first thing was to set up a National Institute of Public Finance. I'm really not seen an Institute of Public Finance in the Arab world yet. I don't know, I mean, I don't know whether that kind of institute exists. The research, the kind of medium-term expenditure framework, these kind of things are extremely important, of course, whether it is for these countries or for the conflict-affected countries. And I think, Khalid, I'll give the floor to you to add on.
Thank you, Niranjan. I think, yes, you've addressed some of the issues that I also would share with you in terms of how to proceed. But there are a couple of things that I think need to be clarified. One, let me get the more difficult question posed by Professor Samir out of the way, which is the political New Deal that everybody's expecting, but I don't think is around the corner yet. There is no question that in this region we need to have this, new political setup, and there's no question that it's the driving force for conflict around us is the lack of clarity on the political scene. And there's no question that you can't talk about development without talking about politics. And this particular report didn't dwell into these issues for the same reason that we didn't want to deal with the other issues related to trade, industrial policies, etc., because we really wanted to isolate fiscal policy per se and say, okay, there's not much that we can do about the other issues, but there are degrees of freedom that you have even under present circumstances. In some countries you can do this, this, and that. But to also answer your question, that we did actually give some thought to that, but not in this report. In another report that was published in 2016, by EDID, called Vision 2030 for the Arab region, in which we actually spent some time thinking about these questions, and there was a whole chapter about the possible political issues, which is not really, our personal strength in the division per se, but we had our colleague Tamim al-Barouti who handled that particular chapter. And so, no, we thought about it, but it was not, we didn't actually import from that report into this. And for those of you who are interested, that report is online. Now let me get back to some of the more, the more controversial issues that I know that we will be talking about today. And of course, one of them is this Washington consensus. Listen, my opinion is that, and here I'm influenced by my pre-analytics, okay, which may be different than yours. I think the Washington Consensus is a bad idea. I think it's, in its construction, it has deep theoretical, empirical flaws, and I think, to be honest, it's dead. I mean, even most serious global economists will tell you, we're now living in a post-Washington Consensus period. Of course, it may not be as dead in all of its aspects. There are some issues in which we all agree that there are some really fundamental problems, like financial sector liberalization. That's where it's really very problematic. Capital controls and the whole debate about it in terms of triggering a financial crisis and all of that. I don't want to get into that, but all I'm trying to say is that the Washington Consensus theoretically had major problems, practically had major problems. And so I also have a problem when we say that, if the Washington Consensus was applied, we would be in a different situation. No, I think that actually, if you look at the scorecard of Arab countries, if you look at 2010, backtrack 2010, look at all of the IMF reports that were published in 2009 to 2010 about the major countries where the Arab Spring took place, and look at the IMF evaluations. I mean, after all, they're the ones who are giving us the scorecards on our performance on the Washington Consensus, and they were all saying that we were doing excellently. Highest marks for this region. Yes. So if they're the ones who are the custodians of the Washington Consensus telling us that you guys, taking into account the crony capitalism, I'm not saying that this didn't happen, But I'm saying that the problem really is in the Washington Consensus, not in the application of the Washington Consensus. But then again, this is the pre-analytics, and we have to, we're coming. I'm a new school economist, so I will differ with you on this, and it's fine to differ with you on this. But I have to say that it's not an ideological debate. It shouldn't be an ideological debate. There are things that we and the IMF will agree on. As I said, if you come to a situation where you're horribly doing bad and you need some short-term fixes, well, obviously, you're going to have to do what it takes in order to get through the next 6 months. I remember when I was working for the Egyptian government in the privatization department, I went up to the minister and I told him, this doesn't make any sense. You guys are selling the best companies in order to then not restructure the worst ones. And then, you're getting a worse portfolio. What's the whole point? There's no economic rationale. And his argument, well, maybe so, but there's a very clear political rationale. If I don't meet that IMF target by next June, I'm not going to be eligible for the Paris Club tranche. And there's a political argument there. I lose my economic argument. So that I think is very important. Second thing I want to talk without taking too much time is that in this region we have a big distribution problem. All the research that was done by Piketty and by us is showing us that in this particular region, the 1%ers are getting a lot more than we think. And when you look at the differences between the national accounts and between the household income surveys, the difference is even growing. And so if I was going to talk about inequality from a Gini point of view, looking at household surveys, factoring in that difference that we're seeing in national accounts, recalculating the Gini, I would say that the Arab region, would comfortably say, is probably the most unequal region in the world. Now, if I believe in that narrative, if I believe in that story, and I'm talking about fiscal policy reforms, well, what's my starting point? Well, get more transparency. At least let me find out what the real expenditure of everybody is, what the real wealth of everybody is. Not to impose draconic taxes on the 1%ers. No, I need them. But I need them to pay their fair share. And that's one of the concrete things that we have in this report. You need to crack down on illicit financing. There are so many things that you can do. We have a whole series of papers in Escrow on that. I don't have the time to get in. But there are very concrete issues in the report that we think that you can do. Now, in Lebanon, for example, where I've lived for 12 years now, I would say that there's no way that you'll be able to be competitive with the current exchange rate regime. Now, I know this is a very touchy issue, but as an economist, how can you compete? In any sector, even tourism, with the current exchange rates. I'm not advocating anything. I'm just saying that this question needs to be posed, needs to be debated from an economic standpoint, not from a political one. At least get the economics right. So let me stop here before I make any more big statements and hand it over.
Few points. Yes, first of all, on the efficiency and distribution issue, I said that, it's mostly probably a wording issue in some parts of the reports. Of course, for growth to be sustainable, it has to be equitable. Probably that is the most important lesson of the Arab Spring or any other basically civil unrest that we've witnessed in the Latin America or in East Asian countries. Equity is essential to sustainability, no question about it. Sometimes in the report you feel that there is more, maybe because of the nature of the Escrow and the nature of basically fiscal policy itself, that in the end is a tool for redistribution in the end, rather than a tool for promoting, although you are doing a very good job in saying how it can promote actually this crowding in, So, but to be clear, it is mostly a wording issue in some part of the reports. Second, on the Washington consensus, we don't want to be stuck in names, It's not really about the Washington consensus, or obviously economic as a field is significantly evolving, and also as in practice, But let's talk about best practice. Is there any doubt that today best practice in terms of government involvement in public services like power and telecom, let me take these two sectors. Can anybody argue that the best role for the government in this sector is not to be a producer, but rather be a regulator? I don't think we can argue with that, you know. I lived in the United States for 15 years. In the United States, where we have a market economy, you know, capitalism at its full form, I was paying lower electricity fees and lower telecom fees than what I'm paying here in Lebanon and getting a much better service. You know, so it's not about Washington consensus or market or it's about the fact that what has been applied in the Arab countries was not a real market economics like we would like to see it, one that promotes competitiveness and efficiency and good pricing. You know, no, you call it consensus, you don't call it Washington, you know, this is a different story. So I'm saying we have major gaps to fill in the proper working of our economies while simultaneously thinking about the distributional issues, you know. So regarding the point on Lebanon, of course, Razan, you put your hand again, you know, I mean, on the problem, I mean, and this is where we get to the sequencing that I talked about. Okay, I mean, you have now, we're putting together a budget for 2018. 68% of your expenditure, 68% of your expenditures are on paying back the debt, wages and end of service indemnities, and subsidies to EDL. I mean, how can you create any fiscal space with this? How can you do any social spending? How can you basically empower your citizens through CapEx? Now that we have to go to the international community. But then you have to come and increase taxes. Where are the taxes? Where VAT, extremely regressive. Absolutely, extremely regressive. Income tax and profit tax in an economy at 1.5% growth, where already you have significant increase in non-performing loans in the banking sector, where you already have lots of cash basically squeezed companies. Of course, there is a lot of room to do in tax policy in Lebanon to make it fairer, more progressive. But as we say, you should make hay while the sun shines. You know, I mean, it's very difficult to do reform in times of deep economic recessions. You know, of course, there are no easy answers. Obviously, you know, I mean, it is very difficult, and I think definitely reports like this are very useful in basically giving directions to where we should be heading.
Just one point. You make the last statement that fiscal policy is mainly for redistribution. There is a huge academic debate on that, and that's basically was the view of Washington Consensus. Yes. Past 30 years, there was not a single report on fiscal policy except what IMF was doing. It is after SDGs that they thought of, this fiscal stimulus really worked. You know, so then there is really a role of public sector investment, and if you look at the readings of Stiglitz on post-Washington consensus, as he calls it. I just wanted to comment on that. And the other point is the ODA is no matter reducing. The role of international community on development, and where will the money come from? If you look at external sector, there is definitely not more room for developing countries at this stage. The room lies in utilizing what we have. Like there is a huge illicit trafficking that, as Khalid mentioned, and that too in the trade sector. 75% of the invoices that is the major source of illicit trafficking. We have a report on financing for development there, and fixing the domestic house first. We cannot go ahead unless we fix our house first. Whether we can fix the politics, that is a bigger question. That we are not going into that. We are trying to see whether we can see economic governance makes sense, and we can use fiscal policy in a way that is not just for distribution, but for improving substantive sectors and producing employment that helps people. Thank you.
Yes.
My question actually concerns the title of your report, Rethinking Fiscal Policy in the Arab World. After what you presented, what certainly was very interesting, I'm wondering how much is it actually rethinking fiscal policy other than revisiting and coming to the same conclusions? Oil-rich countries spend a lot and are rich, oil-poor countries spend little and are poor. That's things we already knew. Like, isn't it really time to rethink fiscal policy in the Arab world, and also maybe stop generalizing the Arab world as a whole, especially when it comes to fiscal policy, because what we've seen is that there is two different groups at least of countries when it comes to fiscal policy. Some that have a lot more room, some that have a lot more flexibility because of their resources, the other group that doesn't have that. One group that's relatively solid in terms of international rating and thus has access to financial funding, another group that doesn't have that. Like, looking at these differences in these two major groups, isn't it important to then split it and actually really rethink fiscal policy maybe separately for each of those groups?
Any other questions before I give the floor to I have one question about Dr. Asad Khalid. How does one move into this threshold about economic governance? What steps ought to be taken to get into that threshold whereby if you reach that threshold, you will get the kind of HDI improvement that you want to have? How do you do that? That's all.
Okay, you're spot on. I mean, this is the what's new here. We actually debated whether, to have that title, Rethinking. There was a big debate on it. I don't think we're saying anything that is really genuinely new, but we're asking, we're pleading, given all of the indicators that we've seen, given the troubles, given the conflicts. And maybe on this I will ask Salim to also have an intervention, because he hasn't spoken yet, and he was also part of the conflict chapter, which I think is one of the most innovative parts of the report, where you can really do the rethinking. So if you don't mind, I'll just give the floor for Salim for 2 minutes to talk about that particular point. But the issue is that we need to make a case that you must rethink the governance architecture. Okay, the economic policy options that we have, the fiscal space options, whether it's debt, whether it's ODA, whether it's expenditure switching or revenue mobilization, are all known, and it's a question of how much do I emphasize this versus that, given that ODA is going down and given what we know. But I can do a lot more to rethink how we take decisions about fiscal policy internally, and that goes to your questions. Open budgets. How do you do a budget, And you sit down, and each ministry starts giving you its shopping list, and then people put it together at the Ministry of Finance, and then it's a political pleasing process, so I make sure that this guy who's the nephew of that guy is happy, and okay, we have a budget. No, you need to move to a much more open budget where you bring in civil society, advocates, where you have information about poverty distributions, where you have information about wealth distribution, where you have information about income distribution, and then you make hard political decisions based on this. It's transparency and governance, and it has to start with voice and accountability. It has to start. Well, that's a political, I don't know, that is the tough part. How do you kickstart it? But I think countries like Lebanon and Tunis are in a better starting point on that, because here you have much more of leeway in order for you to begin this kind of process. And I think the opportunities in this country with the coming revenue stream, if it does come on the oil side, I think you need to, my personal recommendation, have a huge debate on that. Okay, and I don't want to preempt what the outcome of the debate would be. I would love to see a better infrastructure in this country. But that's another issue. But have a huge debate and use that as an entry point to get into the whole thing. But the real contribution for the rethinking, I think, comes in Salim's chapter. Salim, tell us, how can we do this?
I'm not going to tell you how we're going to do this, but part of the issue that we got stuck in when we were trying to defend our point, and especially in conflict-affected countries, and going back to Mr. Swade's point, and what's the sequence? So the main most important issue that we face is where to start in conflict-affected countries. What are the challenges? What are the priorities? We get stuck between short-term commitments and long-term commitments. And if we start with the short-term commitments and forget the long-term commitments, we might not have a sustainable reconstruction plan eventually. And if we start with the long-term commitments and we neglect the short-term commitments, we might end up in more episodes of civil conflict. So this is so we came up with the conventional way of reconstruction is let's go and focus on official development aid that we can get and donations that we get from countries that can flow into the system, and we'll start reconstructing. And this is not a possible case due to the fact that we looked at countries that had civil conflict previously, and we looked at the first 10 years after the conflict, and we've seen that the official development aid will go up in a spike and then goes down, and it has similar symptoms for the Dutch disease issue. So we realized that if we wanted to have a sustainable reconstruction plan that can go from A to Z, we need to not focus specifically on official development aid. We need to focus more on the domestic drivers of the company and to figure out how to reactivate and how to make the economy dynamic again with the given potential that is already in the, which will provide more revenues for the system in a short period of time, and then we start utilizing. So the best option is to get, if you wanted to have official development aid, you have to have it along the period of the reconstruction plan. You can't just give countries a small amount of money and then tell them, you know what, now I'm going to stop because all the investments are going to be reliant on this official. And this is part what happened in Lebanon, it happened in Angola and other countries. So,
Salim, I'm afraid our time is up. Please join me in thanking the panelists for a very exciting panel. Thank you.